Welcome to the debate. Picture a Fortune 500 CEO.
Okay.
They negotiate billion-dollar corporate mergers before lunch. They can spot a financial predator from a mile away. And they manage entire boardrooms with, absolute precision.
Right. Highly capable people.
Exactly. But when they go home, they are completely dismantled by a single, perfectly timed sigh from their partner. A subtle, weaponized sigh from someone playing the ultimate victim. I mean, how does a brilliant, highly capable mind get trapped in a psychological cage it can't even see?
Well, this is exactly what trips victims up. We assume high intellect provides some sort of absolute defense against abuse. But in the hidden world of covert narcissism and coercive control, a victim's intelligence, their deep empathy, and their profound capacity for endurance, those are the exact traits that are weaponized against them.
Which is terrifying.
It really is. They end up walking on eggshells, right? Their reality is just completely eroded by covert gaslighting, and they have absolutely no idea they are in a trap until the door is already locked.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. Drawing on a pretty comprehensive body of clinical research on relational trauma, we are dissecting the mechanics of trauma bonding, and specifically, we have to answer this central question. Is a trauma bond primarily a neurobiological hijacking like a literal chemical addiction driven by unpredictable rewards?
Or, on the flip side, is fundamentally a psychodynamic repetition compulsion, an unconscious drive to reenact and resolve childhood wounds?
Right. And I will be arguing that trauma bonding is essentially a neurochemical hijacking. It's a biological addiction forged by intermittent reinforcement that just violently overrides the victim's logic, their memory, and their executive functioning.
And I will be arguing that the bond is fundamentally psychological. While the biology is real, and we'll get into that, it only takes hold because a pre-existing psychological blueprint allows it to. The bond is rooted in repetition compulsion, where the victim unconsciously seeks out familiar, often painful childhood attachment patterns, which makes this chaotic dynamic feel, tragically, entirely like home.
So let's start with the biological reality of how this trap is actually set. Trauma bonds are the direct, inevitable result of a partial reward schedule. I mean, if you look at basic behavioral psychology, if a rat presses a lever and gets a pellet every single time, it eventually gets bored.
Right, the novelty wears off.
Exactly. But if it presses the lever and gets a pellet only sometimes, totally unpredictably, it will press that lever until it literally dies of exhaustion. That is what intermittent reinforcement does to the mammalian brain.
Yeah. The slot machine effect.
Precisely. The covert narcissist's initial love bombing phase floods the victim's brain with dopamine and oxytocin. This establishes a baseline of intense euphoria. But then comes the devaluation phase, right? The subtle criticisms, the weaponized incompetence, the silent treatment.
Which feels like a sudden withdrawal.
Yes, a literal withdrawal. This sudden drop in dopamine floods the brain with cortisol, our primary stress hormone. And this constant violent cycling between immense stress and intense pleasure physically rewires the brain's reward circuitry.
Okay, but...
Wait, just to finish this point. The highly developed intellect of our executive is completely bypassed by their nervous system's desperate chase for endogenous opioids, the body's natural painkillers that are released during fleeting moments of reconciliation. This isn't a childhood script, It is a profound chemical dependency.
Okay, the physiological toll you are describing is entirely accurate, but framing this strictly as a mechanical, chemical loop ignores the underlying software running the machine. I mean, why does the love bombing work on the specific person in the first place?
Because it's designed to trigger universal human reward centers. But relying on modern attachment theory, we see that individuals are driven by repetition compulsion. To understand this, we have to look back to a concept Freud observed in a child playing a game, the fort dog game.
Right, with the wooden spool.
Yes. He watched a child throw a wooden spool on a string away from himself, saying fort or gone, and then reel it back in, saying da or there. The child was practicing the profound pain of his mother leaving, over and over to feel a sense of mastery and control over her absence. That is repetition compulsion.
But how does that map onto a highly functioning adult? Because the victim of a covert narcissist is unconsciously reenacting unresolved childhood trauma. The nervous system uses what we call neuroception, a subconscious radar that constantly scans the environment for safety or threat.
Sure.
For survivors of early relational trauma, a steady, reliable, calm partner actually triggers their neuroception as foreign, boring, or even suspicious. It is the unpredictable, hypercritical partner that feels familiar and paradoxically safe.
Okay, but if we look at the immediate, tactical brilliance of the predator, the dynamic actually starts long before the victim projects any childhood script onto them. Let's look at the initial hook.
All right, let's look at it.
Covert narcissists don't usually present as grandiose or arrogant initially, right? They present as the long-suffering, fragile, misunderstood victim of the world. Wait, look at how they use pity. That's not depression. That's weaponized guilt.
It is incredibly manipulative, yes.
They use that projected fragility to initiate the bond, flooding the capable executive with warmth and extreme validation the very moment the executive steps in to rescue or help them. The predator creates the baseline.
Yes, they use pity. But many people encounter someone throwing a pity party, recognize it as emotionally draining, and simply walk away. Securely attached people do not stay to rescue the covert narcissist.
Well,
No, hear me out. The ones who stay do so because of what psychologists call unconscious casting. The victim's internal working model is projecting an internalized early caregiver onto the abuser. When that covert narcissist drops the mask, when they go from showering the victim with affection to deploying a punishing silent treatment over nothing, a securely attached person would say, "This is entirely unacceptable," and leave.
but the trauma bond.
But a survivor of early relational trauma stays because their psyche deeply recognizes the dynamic. Their internal narrative says, if I can just fix this broken person, if I can just earn their love by being perfect, I will finally master the painful situation I couldn't control as a child. They are trying to renovate a haunted house into a safe home, and the covert narcissist relies entirely on that dynamic.
I hear you, but you are assuming the victim has full access to their rational decision-making capabilities when the mask drops, which biologically they absolutely do not.
Because of the stress response.
Exactly. When the abuser suddenly shifts to word salad arguments, where, a simple disagreement over doing the dishes turns into a dizzying maze of deflections, projection, and totally unrelated past grievances, the victim's brain goes into literal chemical withdrawal. They are starved of dopamine and drowning in cortisol.
It's crazy making.
It is. Think of the brain's prefrontal cortex as our executive CEO. When the abuser drops that word salad, they are effectively pulling the fire alarm in the victim's brain. The CEO doesn't get to make rational decisions during a fire drill, right? The security team takes over. The amygdala, our threat detection center, completely hijacks the system.
Right, fight or flight.
And you cannot logic your way out of a fire drill. I mean, if this is merely a psychological childhood script, why does the chronic flooding of stress hormones cause literal, measurable cognitive symptoms? We see profound memory loss and brain fog in these victims.
Which is a form of dissociation.
But it happens because excess cortisol is physically neurotoxic to the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for short-term memory consolidation. The executive's brain is metabolically impaired, actively preventing them from using their highly developed problem-solving skills to just walk away.
See, framing this as purely metabolic, as just a brain temporarily poisoned by cortisol, really misses the deep psychological utility of that brain fog. That brain fog is dissociation, and it serves a critical survival function.
Surviving what? A bad conversation?
Surviving betrayal. When the victim is confronted with that crazy-making word salad, their internal system is overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance of betrayal trauma. According to Jennifer Freyd's groundbreaking research on betrayal trauma blindness, when an individual depends on an attachment figure for survival or emotional stability, they literally cannot afford to fully recognize that figure's abusive behavior.
Right. The dependency overrides the threat detection.
Exactly. If a child recognizes their parent as a monster, they die because they cannot survive on their own. So the mind actively suppresses the betrayal. It suppresses the memory of the abuse to preserve the critical bond.
And this mechanism carries directly into adulthood.
Even for an independent, wealthy executive?
Yes, because the nervous system doesn't care about your bank account. The covert narcissist manipulates the victim's reality so thoroughly through gaslighting that the victim begins to internalize the abuse as their own character flaw. They think, I must be remembering it wrong. I must be the crazy one. The brain fog is the psyche's way of protecting the victim from a reality that would shatter their entire world.
The cognitive dissonance is absolutely devastating. Yes. But let's examine how that dissonance is maintained on a physical level, minute to minute. Consider the fawn response.
Ah, yes, fawning.
When the narcissist uses dog whistle abuse, let's say you're at a dinner party and the abuser delivers a subtle micro-insult or a very specific look of disappointment that literally only the victim understands.
Those invisible red flags.
Yes, the victim's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal, or HPA axis, fires instantly. Their body is flooded with adrenaline. In that split second, the traditional fight or flight pathways are entirely blocked.
Because fighting causes a scene.
Right. Fighting a covert narcissist in public just makes the victim look unhinged, which perfectly feeds the narcissist's victim narrative. And fleeing the dinner party feels socially impossible. So the victim's nervous system defaults to the fawn response.
They start appeasing.
They instantly start people-pleasing. They laugh at the insult, they overfunction, they manage the abuser's mood. I argue that fawning is not a deep psychological identity. It is a real-time biological imperative to pacify an immediate physical threat when all other survival pathways are cut off.
I have to completely disagree that it is just a real-time tactical maneuver. The fawn response is an ingrained, deeply structural identity for these survivors.
How so?
If we draw on Pete Walker's work on complex PTSD, the fawn response is the compulsive need to appease and anticipate another person's needs at the total expense of the self. This was installed in childhood as a primary defense mechanism. The covert narcissist recognizes this wiring the second they meet the victim.
Like a predator smelling blood in the water.
Exactly. They know this person is an endlessly giving, self-sacrificing supply. So when that micro-insult hits at the dinner party, the victim isn't just reacting to the present moment. Let's look at this through the lens of internal family systems, or IFS, a model developed by Richard Schwartz.
The parts model.
Right. In IFS, our psyche is made of multiple distinct parts. When the abuser attacks, the victim's internal manager and fawning parts are instantly activated. Why? They jump in to protect a deeply buried exile part of the psyche.
And the exile is the trauma?
The exile is the wounded inner child that carries immense core shame and believes it is inherently defective and unlovable. The narcissist doesn't just trigger momentary fear with that micro-insult. They trigger the victim's oldest, most agonizing shame. Fawning is the manager part desperately trying to keep that exile from being totally crushed.
But look at the staggering physiological cost of that internal management. You're talking about parts and exiles, but I'm looking at a central nervous system subjected to violent, unpredictable swings that destroy the body over time. It literally does, as Bessel van der Kolk has documented. The driven executive we talked about is already managing a massive chronic cortisol load just from running a company. When you superimpose the trauma bond's massive cortisol spikes over that, the physical body begins to break down.
Yeah, the autoimmune issues.
Exactly. We see severe gastrointestinal disturbances, autoimmune flare-ups, chronic pain syndromes. The abuser deliberately uses intermittent reinforcement to create this instability. It is calculated. They create a baseline of severe anxiety and fear, and then, just when the victim is about to break, they offer a tiny crumb of affection.
Just enough to keep them hooked.
An apology, a warm hug. That crumb initiates a massive release of endogenous opioids in the victim's brain. The victim experiences a profound drug-like high. They become biologically addicted to the relief from the abuse, and they tragically confuse that chemical relief with true love.
I agree that the physical toll is immense, and the addiction to relief is a highly accurate way to describe the sensation. But to call it a simple, cold calculation on the abuser's part misses the truly insidious nature of the psychological entanglement.
How is it not calculated? Look at the tactics.
Because covert narcissists often entirely believe their own victimhood. They aren't always twirling a mustache in a dark room. They genuinely feel persecuted by the world. They use a defense mechanism known as projective identification.
Projecting their flaws onto the victim?
Right, meaning they cannot tolerate their own feelings of inadequacy, shame, or toxicity. So they unconsciously project those feelings onto the victim. And here's where the psychological blueprint is crucial. The victim, conditioned since childhood to take responsibility for everyone else's emotions, catches that projection and absorbs it.
So they take on the abuser's shame.
They literally feel the abuser's shame as if it were their own. The driven woman's greatest strength, her immense capacity to solve problems and endure hardship, is weaponized against her. She treats the abuser's cruelty, their depression, their silent treatments as a complex project to manage, rather than a dangerous threat to escape. That is the repetition compulsion at work. She is trying to fix the unfixable parent by fixing the partner.
And while she is exhausting herself trying to fix the partner is strategically and systematically dismantling her life. I mean, look at the smear campaigns. Covert narcissists are masters of preemptive narrative control.
Oh, absolutely. The subtle character assassinations.
They carefully cultivate relationships with the victim's friends, family, and colleagues, subtly planting seeds of doubt about the victim's mental health long before the relationship ends. "I'm so worried about her lately. She's been so unstable," they'll whisper, framing themselves as the devoted, long-suffering partner.
It's sick. It really is.
By the time the victim finally tries to leave, their entire community is primed to view the abuser as the victim. This is coercive control in its purest, most destructive form. And because the bond is fundamentally a chemical addiction built on this total environmental control, the path to extrication must be treated exactly like a severe drug withdrawal.
See, I worry about that framing. If you treat it strictly like a drug detox, you are forcing the victim into behavioral isolation, which is the exact opposite of what a relationally traumatized nervous system needs to heal.
But you have to stop the bleeding first. The only way to break the bond is to permanently cut off the chemical supply. The solution demands strict no contact. And if they share children or a business and cannot go no contact, it demands the gray rock method.
Being as uninteresting as possible.
Absolute emotional disengagement, where the victim makes themselves as uninteresting, monotone, and unresponsive as a literal gray rock. The victim has to understand that when they do this, they will face what behavioral scientists call the extinction burst.
Which is the severe escalation of abusive tactics when the abuser realizes their typical manipulative buttons are no longer working.
Exactly. It's the absolute tantrum the predator throws when the slot machine suddenly stops paying out. They will beg, they will threaten self-harm, they will stalk, they will deploy flying monkeys to guilt the victim.
It's the most dangerous time for the victim.
It is. And during this extinction burst, the victim's dopamine levels plummet completely. They're left with nothing but a cortisol-drenched trauma response, literally shaking in their bed, craving the abuser's comfort to soothe the pain the abuser caused. They have to white-knuckle it for 30 to 90 days to let their neurochemical baseline naturally reset.
That sounds like torture.
It is, but they have to wait for the endogenous opioid deficit to normalize. Cognitive insight isn't enough, You can read all the psychology books in the world, but you still have to physically detox from the abuser.
While physical safety and strict boundaries are absolutely non-negotiable, I will give you that. Cognitive and behavioral isolation, just white-knuckling through a detox in a dark room, is a recipe for relapse.
Why?
Because this trauma happened within a relationship, which means the deepest healing must be relational. As Sue Johnson, the pioneer of emotionally focused therapy, consistently pointed out, our deepest wounds are relational, and human nervous systems are biologically designed to heal in connection with others, not in isolation.
But connecting with others doesn't erase the addiction to the abuser.
No, but if you just isolate the victim to wait out a chemical clock, you leave them entirely alone with their deeply activated, deeply shamed exile parts, listening to the echoes of the abuser's gaslighting in their own head.
But simply connecting with a therapist or a support group doesn't instantly stop the profound physiological cravings for the abuser's specific validation.
It doesn't stop the craving instantly, no, but it fundamentally rewires how the body perceives safety over time. The survivor needs somatic therapy and safe, consistent therapeutic connections to experience what nervous system expert Deb Donna calls glimmers.
Glimmers being the opposite of triggers?
Precisely. If triggers are cues of danger that send the nervous system into fight or flight, glimmers are micro moments of safety and connection that gently bring the nervous system back to a state of calm and regulation.
Okay.
For a highly driven individual whose entire relational history has been organized around earning love through sacrifice and enduring abuse, these glimmers initially feel unbearable. When a therapist or a new friend offers them genuine kindness with absolutely no strings attached, their system panics.
Because it's unfamiliar?
Exactly. Their neuroception signals danger, because they don't know what to do with kindness that asks nothing in return. They need a trauma-informed professional to help them slowly reorganize their nervous system around this completely unfamiliar experience of unconditional safety. You cannot just detox the addiction. You have to surgically heal the underlying psychological wound that made the addiction possible in the first place, or they will just find another covert narcissist in a different mask.
The risk of relapse is real, I concede that. But if we don't first stabilize the neurobiology by entirely stopping the unpredictable swings of dopamine and cortisol, any psychodynamic therapy is just going to bounce off a nervous system that is trapped in active survival mode.
You can't do deep therapy in a burning building.
Exactly. When a victim first escapes, they are suffering from the contrast effect. This is a cognitive bias where a single tiny fake gesture of kindness from the abuser after weeks of emotional starvation feels like the most profound love they have ever experienced. The detox has to come first.
I hear what you're saying about the sequence.
The victim has to reclaim their executive sovereignty, calm the amygdala, and get the prefrontal cortex back online by starving the bond of the intermittent reinforcement that actively feeds it. Only then can they begin to untangle the psychological blueprint you're talking about.
Yes, stabilization is the first phase of all trauma recovery. We agree there. But if we frame it purely as a mechanical detox, we risk invalidating the profound psychological grief the victim is experiencing.
Grief for the abuser?
Grief for the illusion. This isn't just about stress chemicals leaving the body. It is the shattering of a deeply held belief. It is the agonizing grief of realizing that the power couple dynamic they sacrificed their sanity for, the future they built, was entirely a mirage. The covert narcissist was never truly there.
Just a projection.
Right. And if we don't directly address the psychological devastation, the shame of staying so long, the loss of identity, the terrifying fear of the failure label in their professional life, they will return to the abuser to avoid feeling that grief. The covert narcissist relies entirely on that shame. They want the victim to feel too embarrassed, too crazy, to seek the specialized support they desperately need. Reclaiming one's identity requires actively integrating those fragmented parts of the self, sitting with the exiles and mourning the illusion, not just waiting for hormones to balance out.
I think we are circling a crucial, unifying realization here. Whether we view this destruction through the lens of a neurochemical slot machine effect, fundamentally altering the brain's reward centers, or through the lens of a deep-seated repetition compulsion rooted in unresolved childhood wounds, the sheer insidious nature of coercive control is undeniable.
Completely undeniable.
The abuser systematically and deliberately chips away at a person's sense of reality, their self-worth, and their fundamental agency, leaving a highly capable person completely immobilized.
Absolutely. And what is perhaps most tragic about this entire dynamic is how the victim's highest, most admirable traits are weaponized against them.
Their competence?
Yes, their high intelligence, their deep empathy, their exceptional endurance, and ability to manage crises. The exact traits that make them incredibly successful leaders in the boardroom are the very tools the covert narcissist uses to keep them trapped in the living room. The abuser doesn't choose them because they are weak or gullible. They choose them because they are uniquely, powerfully resourced to absorb the abuse and take absolute responsibility for fixing it.
And both of our frameworks highlight a frightening counterintuitive truth. Cognitive insight alone, simply knowing and naming that the abuse is happening, is completely insufficient to break the bond.
It's just not enough.
A brilliant executive can chart out exactly how they are being manipulated, gaslit, and controlled on a whiteboard, and yet still find their heart racing and their body physically relaxing when the abuser touches their arm and offers a completely hollow apology. The hardware of our biology and the software of our developmental history are profoundly, inextricably intertwined.
Which is exactly why unraveling a trauma bond is one of the most difficult, courageous psychological endeavors a human being can undertake. It requires enduring the biological agony of withdrawal, while simultaneously integrating fragmented parts of the self, reclaiming a stolen identity, and learning, perhaps for the very first time in their lives, how to tolerate a love that doesn't require self-destruction. There is so much more to explore in the clinical literature regarding how survivors can rebuild their nervous systems and reclaim their sovereignty after this kind of invisible violence.
There certainly is. And we leave it to you, the listener, to consider which framework better explains the hidden binding forces of these toxic relationships. Do you see the literal chemical chains of intermittent reinforcement holding the brain hostage? Or do you see the deep psychological grooves of an ancient childhood script unconsciously seeking resolution?
Think back to that highly successful executive sitting in their pristine boardroom, completely in command of their world. When they go home and face that weaponized sigh, what is truly happening in the dark spaces of the mind?
It is a question that challenges everything we think we know about human connection, vulnerability, and control.
Thank you for joining us.